Okay, so this is titled The Victorian Age, but actually I will be swinging back and forth. Queen Victoria ruled a long time, so there's an entire age that is called Victorian Age. And it is sort of, it has some sense to talk about the Victorian Age, because between in those 60, 70 years, a lot of things happened just before World War I, basically. So, in terms of ideas, of course, Charles Darwin is important. As I mentioned repeatedly, many people thought that animals evolved. So the idea of evolution was not particularly new. What was lacking was a scientific theory of evolution. And that's what Darwin did. Lamarck did it before him, and then Darwin did it. And the way he did it worked, still works today. And the fundamental idea, I summarize it here with evolution equal variation and selection. So first of all, the children are not identical to the parents, otherwise there would be no evolution. Okay? If it were just like a machine producing identical copies, that's it. That's what bacteria do, by the way. They just produce identical copies. But that's not the rule for the other animals. So they produce children at different variation. Okay? You can't, even if you really try very hard, you can't make a clone of yourself. And then the environment selects which of these variations work. Okay? That's very simple. That's the fundamental principle. And so the concept of adaptation is born. Okay? New species are the ones that adapt to the environment. And the thing that makes it complicated is that the environment is not stable. Things happen. Okay? So that's the fundamental idea. And then in the next 150 years, we have applied the same idea to all sorts of things, from society to software. So the idea that wherever there is a population that exhibits variation, then you can apply selection and decide which are the best ones. And these ones propagate. These ones then make children and create a new population. And again, this population will have variation. Within this variation, the best ones survive, and you go on and on and on. Okay. So at the same time, but this was not discovered until the year 1900 actually. Mendel, working in seclusion, he realized that yes, children are not identical to the parents, but children inherit something from the parents. And until they rediscovered Mendel, it was not really clear what children inherit from parents. He's the one who pointed out there must be discrete units of inheritance. If your parents have blue eyes, your mother's blue eyes, and your father's dark eyes, most likely you don't get something in between blue and dark. You get either blue or either dark. And in my case, both of my parents had dark eyes, but they were ancestors who had blue eyes. Okay? So he came up with, he studied peace, by the way, not children. He came up with the idea there must be discrete units of inheritance. Okay? There must be something that says blue eyes, and every now and then you get selected, and then you get blue eyes. And then there's another one that says green eyes. Nature does not make a merge, an average of these traits. You get one or the other. So that's the beginning of the idea of the genes. In philosophy, Kierkegaard was from Scandinavia. So there will be two big currents of thought later that will peak. Will actually peak about 100 years later. One is phenomenology, and one is existentialism. And both are reactions again to the industrial society, to the scientific revolution, so science starts from the concept that there's an observer and there's a system to be observed. Okay, and there are two different things. and you cannot do science if you don't do that. Okay, but actually Kierkegaard and later, much more forcefully, other philosophers said that's just not true. You are part of the system you're studying. And the other thing that that started a discussion, the other discussion that started back then was, does all of this that we are creating make you happy? What is the ultimate goal of your existence? Okay. So these two discussions are among the many things that Kierkegaard discussed, and his influence will be more obvious a little later. But those are broad discussions on your life. Okay? It's not so abstract, actually. It sounds abstract, but it's really specifically about who are we and how we should live our life. Does it make sense? Does it make sense that I study the world without considering that I am part of the world? And what exactly is the meaning of my existence? Yeah, so these big questions are beginning to come out. Kant, Hegel, and so on, they sometimes discuss this, but I'm much more interested in the big system. Okay. So Kierkegaard makes it more personal, and we'll see that ones who come later make it more and more personal. Now, no surprise that because of the working class, because we have created this very unfair system, the industrial society has created the working class and the capitalists, and there's a huge gap between these. Then you have the birth of all these different philosophies that are generally called Utopian Socialism. These are all people who want to eliminate that wealth gap. And some of them even want to eliminate government. So it's beyond just let's eliminate the king. It's beyond of that. They see authority as oppressive, and they see capitalism as unfair. Guess what? If you think that today we have successful terrorists, think of the terrorists back then. They assassinated a Tsar, French president, an Austrian empress, a Spanish prime minister, an Italian king, US President McKinley, Spanish prime minister. So there was a movement that eventually became very violent and actually very successful in assassinating important people. And World War I will start with the assassination of a major politician. Marx. So Marx is the big, most influential ideologue to come out of this discussion, and is frequently misunderstood, sometimes even demonized, which his purpose was not that political. So first of all, he said something that actually is kind of trivial. How does the capitalist make money? Why are capitalists so rich and the working class so poor? Because working class produces something, there's a surplus, that surplus goes to the capitalist. Okay, so capitalist gets richer and richer, but the ones who are actually doing the work are the workers. So the working class gets alienated. That will become a popular term for two reasons. One, because the money goes to the capitalist, not to them. And second, because actually the factory does not belong to them. Now, if you think at the time of Marx was living that transition. It used to be that the tools of production belong to the guy who's working. You know, you have your little shop, and you own the little shop, and that's where you make things. With the factory, that's no longer true. You go to work for somebody else. There's somebody else who owns the factory. So that also produces alienation in the working class. So his conclusion was the working class is not happy. And then his utopian view of the world was that all nations go through 5 economic stages. You have slavery, feudalism, capitalism. So he thought, we're living here now, okay? And when you have capitalism, when capitalism becomes really, really good, eventually it turns into socialism. And then socialism, where it means that the workers own the factory. Okay? I keep saying Silicon Valley is socialist, because the startup, people own the startup. Then you have communism, where now people rule and there's absolute equality and so on. Now, the thing that is often misunderstood in this picture is that, so the thing that everybody knows is that eventually said the working class shall overthrow the capitalist class. And that was not a, we have to do it. That was a, it is going to happen. You know, it was a scientific theory. It said after capitalism will come socialism, period. The thing people often misunderstand is that he thought socialism was an evolution of capitalism. And in fact, where it was really wrong is that he thought socialism will come in the countries that are most industrialized. It turned out communism, socialism and communism will come in the countries like Russia and China, not to mention Cuba and North Korea, that are the least industrialized, right? So he was wrong about that. But his idea was socialism is the natural next stage in this process. Yeah. That's what I was saying. Ironically, he was wrong about which countries were going to have the communist revolution. So for mathematics, I don't want to spend too much time because it gets a little technical, but between Boole, Gauss, and Riemann, there's a complete redefinition of what mathematics and geometry are, logic in general. Well, Boole is important for us because Boolean algebra is what our smartphones and computers use, 0, 1, true, false. Okay, he started it. And he started in a very simple matter. He realized that all propositions can reduce to things like, you know, I don't know, it is raining. That's either true or false. And then you combine it with, I don't have an umbrella, and you get something out of it. So true and false, you combine them, and you get things, and some other rules. This was actually the first major revision of the system of syllogism that Aristotle had invented more than 2,000 years earlier. Now, Gauss and Riemann are important because they thought new, again, something that has lasted more than 2,000 years. For 2,000 years, the Western world thought Euclid's geometry is true, obviously true. You know, that's the line, that's the point, that's the line, that's the circle. You know, and there's some triangle and there's some relationships, mathematical relationships between angles, sizes, radius, circumference, and so on. And one fundamental thing that Euclid took for granted was if you draw two parallel lines, they will never intersect. Parallel lines go on forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. Well, Gauss was the first one to realize that that's actually not necessarily true. It depends. It depends on what. If you have a flat space, they will never intersect. But if the space is curved, they might actually end up like this and touch, or they may end up diverging. So it really depends on what kind of space you have. Of course, the Greeks never thought of any other space than flat space. You know, this room, the floor is flat. But if the floor is not flat, different things happen. So Gauss was the first one to imagine space could be different than what we experience. That was not trivial in 1820-something. And Riemann would remain little known outside of mathematical circles until Einstein's general relativity. He built a huge geometric theory out of this, where he really generalized the idea, what is a geometry, what is a space? You can have different spaces, and we got to have formulas that work everywhere. And it's a special case if the space is flat, you get the traditional triangle and the parallel lines and everything. But if the space is not flat, you get something else. And it was complicated math, and you know, it was just, at the time, it was just thought experiment. You know, mathematicians like to just imagine things. This is also the age, in this class we don't have time to talk a lot about literature and art, but this is also the age where you see a boom of poetry. That's the Romantic age. And these are just some of my favorites. The list is wildly incomplete. It happens pretty much all over Western Europe. You have a boom of poetry. Music, the symphony orchestra was born in the 18th century, and also things like the piano became popular and so forth, and then you have Mozart, Schubert, Beethoven. You also have these great composers in this age. Poetry and music, what they have in common, big emotions and pathos. Okay, so we get to 1845. This is the British Empire. So Britain has become the main power, especially after defeating Napoleon. That was the only one who could rival them. And South America got independence. Most of these are independent. The borders are not exactly today's, but you can recognize today's countries. And Africa, it's either colonized or to be colonized. This is, the Ottomans are a huge empire. Austria is the biggest empire in Central Europe. And Russia is expanding east, becoming a huge country. India has collapsed. Collapsed, has been conquered. So it's,
I didn't realize that Holland was settled in
Indonesia. And Holland had a piece of the Americas.
Huh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, and Portugal, teeny Portugal, used to have a lot of this. Eventually was kicked out by the Dutch and the British. But this is Portugal, Angola, this is Portugal, Mozambique. So yeah, small European countries had far-fetched empires. Two major things happened after 1845. Two major wars. The first one is that one of the German states, so the biggest German-speaking state was Austria. Austria was an empire, though. It was one of the exceptions in Europe. We'll get there soon. The second most powerful was Prussia at that point, which had gone through an incredible scientific and technological revolution. It was rapidly becoming the second, at that point it was the second most industrial country in the world after Britain. And guess what? They fight a war against France, the great royal dynasty of France, and they win. There was a major event. It was a relatively small state defeating France. And after that event, Prussia convinced all the other city-states of Germany to unite. And Germany became a country. The only German-speaking state that did not join was Austria. And Austria became a major rival of Prussia. So that created new power in Europe. And one lesson learned from that war was industry make a difference. Prussia was smaller army, maybe even less money, but it was a highly educated and industrial country. Yeah. Prussia had launched the PhD revolution, whatever it's called in German, but that system was born in Prussia. And the second thing that sent shockwaves was the Japanese-Russian War. Japan won. It was the first time that a non-European power beat a European power, or better, a non-Western. It's, of course, Iran, the Arabs and so on, but outside of the Middle East, okay? Japan won against Russia. And that, of course, created a psychology in Japan.
Was Russia trying to capture Japan, or was Japan trying to go into Russia? Like,
it was just a typical war about borders, about...
which border? Like the Japan...
the islands.
Oh, different islands, I see, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Most of these wars started for really not major ideological reasons, but then escalated in real wars. You know? But this one, Japan won. So one thing that comes out of this stories is nationalism. This was not there in the old days. In the Middle Ages, why would somebody go to war? Because the king said so. It wasn't that you felt that that's my enemy. The king said so. That guy is just like me, except he's forced by another king to fight against me. But at this point, the idea of the nation is born. Now, I'm French and they're Germans, they are enemies. It's a much more powerful motivation to go to war. Eventually, this will lead to World War I, where you would shoot somebody just because they speak a different language. And the nations at that point were really good at brainwashing people. So the whole education, teaching history and art and so on, was to glorify the past of the nation. So it was to raise generations that strongly believe we live in the best possible country. Now there were three major exceptions. I already mentioned that when gunpowder arrives, there's three empires that use gunpowder to become very powerful. And those empires, even back then, were already the exception because they were multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-linguistic empires. France is France, Spain is Spain at that point, England is England, Germany is Germany. Austria is an exception. Austria had 50 million people, and today's Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, part of Italy, Romania, they were part of the Austrian Empire. Mostly Christians, but also some Muslims, and different kind of Christianity. They were all under the same emperor. Vienna was an amazing place, actually. Today Vienna is a tourist place, but until World War I, it was one of the most powerful, richest cities in the world. They gave us composers as Strauss and Mahler, painting, Klimt in fiction, Musil and Schnitzler, Freud, philosophy, Husserl were coming there. And I found this picture, which is really interesting. In 1913, just before World War I, yes, these were neighbors. You have Freud was living here, Hitler, the young Hitler, was living there, Trotsky was living here. Trotsky, you know Trotsky? Soviet Revolution was one of the three big ones. Okay. The emperor, of course, is here. And yeah, so it was an interesting, Stalin was there, the young Stalin. So in 1913 they were living there. Not terribly unusual actually, because again, Vienna was a cosmopolitan city, one of the main cities in the world, great education and so on. The other exception was the Ottoman Empire, that was at its peak, 24 million people, Turks, Arabs, and then what today is called the Balkans. Oh, the Greeks, they got Greece. So they had Turks, Arabs, Greeks, and then the Balkans. And then minorities in the Middle East, which even today we still remember Armenians and Kurds, that will become major issues. And the third exception, the Russian Empire, also multi-ethnic. Russians, the Caucasian people, which were partly Muslim, the Central Asian people, partly Muslim, and at that point Poland has been split between Austria and Russia. So they have Poles, Lithuanians, Baltic regions, and so on. So these were the exceptions. In the age of nationalism, there were still three empires. It is also interesting that these three are the ones who did not participate in the colonization of America, Africa, the Far East. Anyway, so Europe is expanding. They leave behind settler societies like Canada, United States, Australia, South Africa, mixed race societies like in Latin America, and then a lot of colonies. India is probably the biggest, and then Africa little by little, France and England will take the majority of the African kingdoms. And as you already noticed, small countries control huge areas. In particular, two small countries, Britain and France, control continents. In a few generations, kids will not believe that that small island in the north of Europe had a huge empire. It just doesn't seem to make sense. So the concept of war changes. You have more and more wars that are outside Europe. Europeans export warfare. So they control 84% of the world in 1914, just territory. Are they rich, those European countries? I have this slide just to show you that obviously there must have been something wrong, because these powerful European states actually witnessed an exodus of their own population. 50 million people leave Europe between the 1800 and 1950. Many of them went to the United States and the rest of Latin America and Australia. So obviously they were not ordinary people. The fact that Britain and France and Spain and Portugal and Holland were building empires does not automatically translate into people getting rich. India is particularly amazing. There were less than 100,000 British soldiers and bureaucrats controlling 250 million Indians. Suez Canal and the Cape became vital to British trade with India. So eventually Britain took over these places that were fundamental to their trade. United States expands, I assume you know this, actually expands very rapidly. It moves west very rapidly. Also benefiting from European stupidity, because Napoleon sold Louisiana for nothing. Louisiana back then was this. And then the Russians sold Alaska also for a few pennies. So the US is already beginning to become a major story, and historians will recognize it only much later. When the United States wins World War II, then it becomes obvious. It's actually interesting that at the beginning of World War I, the United States was probably already the #1 economy in the world, but it was not obvious because they had not fought any major international war. So the United States had already become a big story. It just wasn't so visible. Anyway, what was special about the United States at this point? Well, the only country where you have this strong anti-aristocratic bias. And also, it is already a meritocracy. There's education, technology, and initiative, very important. Everybody's an inventor at this point. So you have a relentless industrialization, which comes from education, technology, and initiative. Relentless expansion, and they're just political. The United States is the most literate country in the world. Prussia would be a close contender, but the United States already had massive education. It started with Boston. Boston was the most literate city pretty much from inception because of the religious groups. And as the United States colonizes, they bring schools everywhere, printing press, and so on. Becomes sort of automatic that there's printed material around.
So it sounds like the U.S. though was literate because of religion, not because of public education.
At the beginning, because of religion, absolutely. Religion had a huge influence on Boston initially. Boston became, which eventually becomes Harvard and MIT. But if you go at the beginning, the printing presses were mostly religious, and the educational institutions were mostly religious. Yes, not unusual. I mean, like the Jesuits did something similar in South America and South Europe. To this day, Catholic schools are better than other schools, right? So, it's not. 1860s, the United States adopted the German system, which today is the PhD. And lots of new inventions. It becomes normal in the United States that you are an inventor. So what in Britain is really confined to Manchester, those 2-3 counties, And Europe as a whole is really mostly confined to the north. The United States becomes the north. You know, everybody tries to invent something different. And there's a simple reason why we'll see this soon. Of course, it depends. The United States depends a lot on immigration to fuel both industrialization and expansion. Of course, if you were in African America, you would tell me, where are the slaves here? Well, that's industrialization and expansion, actually. There was a big difference between the northern states and the southern states. Right? One became industrialized, the other one didn't. So when you're talking about industrialization, you're actually talking about the northern states. And what's the difference between the northern states and southern states? Slavery. Southern states were exactly the condition that Rome was. Rome never industrialized because it had slaves. China never industrialized because it had a lot of cheap labor. The southern states never industrialized because they had slavery. Northern states didn't have slaves, they had to import immigrants, and they were consistently short on labor. Consistently. If you don't have enough labor, what do? You invent machines. As usual, free trade always tends to create an economic boom. The United States created a huge free trade zone that eventually expanded from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. Not a detail. The state was very important. I think I have a slide to show how important the state was in doing these things. One of the most important things was giving land to people. Land had always been very valuable, very precious, and Europe came from centuries of feudalism, where only the Lord owns the land. The United States was given to ordinary people. That was a big thing. I think there were many homestead bills, right? Mm-hmm. That was probably the major one. So the inventors also in the United States, at this point the United States has no science. Who are the big scientists in the United States? You know, the biggest name that comes to mind, probably Benjamin Franklin, but he wasn't even a scientist by the standards of Galileo and Newton. You know, it's inventors. And the inventors are ordinary people. They just look how things work. They don't know the principles of electricity. They just know that if you use electricity this way, something happens. So invention is a normal state of mind. The United States is still largely a rural population. Difference with Britain. Where was the Industrial Revolution born in Britain? Textile industry. Where is the Industrial Revolution born in the United States? In the rural areas. It's for agriculture. It's not for the textile industry, it's for agriculture, mechanization of agriculture. So the Great Plains actually have a part in this history because you have the East Coast where the big cities demand food. Food is coming from the Great Plains, but the Great Plains are empty. There's huge lands that have to be cared by families. You know, the typical farm of Europe had a lot of people, a small land. The typical farm in the United States in the Great Plains had a huge land and a relatively small family. So machines are the solution.